Good morning, everyone. My name is Naweed Hussain Mia, and I am a financial markets specialist at the South African Reserve Bank. I am in the same team with Muka, my colleague Klekani, and Zakele. So thank you, Muka, who just provided an excellent global and domestic overview of benchmark reform. So my role now is to build on that foundation and give you the background that you need to follow the rest of today's discussions with confidence. So this session is intentionally introductory. We know that many attendees come from different parts of the financial ecosystem, and the aim is to ensure that everyone, regardless of how close you are to the transition, has a solid grasp of the key concepts before we get to the more technical sessions later today. So following our presentations, please feel free to ask any questions, no matter how elementary. Now is the time to build that foundation, and we do have technical specialists across the room who we may lean on for any Q&A. So Muka has already touched on what the Market Practitioners Group is. It's a joint public and private sector body. But within the MPG, we have the involvement of regulators, banks, corporates, market infrastructure providers, and professional bodies. And the MPG is made up of 7 underlying work streams. So these work streams, which you see here, are made up of derivatives, cash markets, legal, accounting and tax, governance, data collection and infrastructure, transition planning and coordination, and communications. So you'll hear many of these themes recur throughout the day. For example, the accounting and tax and governance work streams contributions will feed directly into the morning session on the implications of the Jibar cessation date as well as the endgame session. The legal work stream will align closely with the 1 o'clock tough legacy session. So the slide that I have up now is the transition roadmap. This is a high-level roadmap just to highlight to the audience that the reference rate reform program did not happen overnight. Pun very much intended. So I won't go into much detail on each of the underlying milestones that will be reached. This will be covered in the end game for Jibar session, covered at the end of the day. But I think it's important to point out that ZARONIA, as Muka had defined it, was initially published in 2022 and had a 1-year observation period. And in 2023, it was officially endorsed for use in financial contracts. A number of communications came out subsequent to that, as well as the publication of documents such as the Jibar fallback methodology, which included the credit adjustment spread, which Muka highlighted. And these documents are all available on the SARB MPG webpage. Now, we are throwing around a lot of technical terminology, such as fallbacks, credit adjustment spreads, as well as ZARONIA first, and a number of technical concepts that are defined in the glossary. So there are QR codes on the screens in front of you. If at any time you feel lost, please feel free to open the link and head to the glossary, which is at the end of the SARB MPG booklet. In addition, we will circulate these slides. So there might be a bit of text on some of these slides that you may not be able to see if it's a bit small, but please note that we will circulate the slides for your reference to read thereafter. Again, this slide is meant to highlight the work completed to date. Importantly, whilst Jibar was deemed to have vulnerabilities, work had taken place to strengthen Jibar through the revised Jibar Code of Conduct and operating rules. Part of these rules were the increased pricing commitments of Jibar contributing banks and enhanced transparency. As Muka had mentioned, a number of benchmarks were considered to replace Jibar. The SARB has published technical specification papers and had back-tested and refined these proposed benchmarks. One of the benchmarks is the ZASFA rate, which we are currently investigating, and that would be the South African secured financing rate. That rate was not chosen, but ZARONIA was, and that's because of the deep underlying liquidity that underpins ZARONIA, which Muka had touched on. So the MPG made the final decision on the alternative overnight rate, which is ZARONIA, and that actually underpins the discussions for the rest of the day. Importantly, we will touch on the work that has been done to transition to the alternative reference rate. So the establishment of supporting markets was a very important component, as well as ensuring market readiness and providing guidance on regulatory and legislative issues. So all of this is part of the endorsement, encouragement, and education to the market. We've created this enabling environment. We are encouraging market participants to use the rate, and the last phase of the transition will be the actual implementation. So today we are at phase 5, where the announcement of the Jibar cessation date will take place, and that has various implications which will be unpacked in the first session of the day. So as I mentioned, the first step was to enable the use of ZARONIA. Muka had touched on the compounded ZARONIA period averages and index values, which are all available on the SARB webpage, free to use. Importantly, the various work streams which I touched on had put out various market convention papers. So it started with linear derivatives, nonlinear derivatives, and cash instruments. So linear derivatives would incorporate your interest rate swaps. And I think my colleague Zakele will touch on in the first session the broader market size and the overall rand value of outstanding exposures that reference Jibar. So currently, it's just over 43 trillion rands. So that's a gross nominal outstanding exposure of contracts referencing Jibar, the bulk of which references derivatives, and within that, the bulk of which references interest rate swaps. So these are obviously the instruments used by banks to hedge their exposures. So it's a very important component of the transition program and will be covered in 2 sessions, the managing risk session after lunch, as well as the endgame session, which will touch on the derivatives market specifically. Importantly, we had to ensure the readiness of key liquidity and market infrastructure providers. So these would be IDBs, so interdealer brokers, who had to make sure that their systems are operationally ready to support ZARONIA activity, as well as systems and process testing between the market makers. So these would have involved test trades on ZARONIA. We also have speakers from Straight on stage later today, and they will unpack things such as the money market implementation. So essentially, Straight, as the central securities depository in the country, play a role in ensuring that market infrastructures are ready to trade and make use of ZARONIA-based floating rate notes and other cash market instruments. So the previous slide touched on enabling the use of ZARONIA. So what has the MPG done to encourage the use of ZARONIA in financial contracts? Importantly, there is an initiative known as the ZARONIA First Initiative. This is a phased initiative driven largely by the derivatives workstream, which focus on encouraging market participants to, instead of using Jibar, to rather make use of ZARONIA. So the ZARONIA First Initiative for linear derivatives kicked off earlier this year at the end of April, and the non-linear derivatives phase, as well as the cross-currency derivatives phase, kicked off at the end of October. Another initiative aimed at encouraging the use of ZARONIA in financial contracts was the inclusion of fallbacks in Jibar-linked contracts. So this was put forward through a paper also available on the SARB MPG webpage, which recommended the appropriate credit adjustment spread, which Muka had touched on, and the intention of that is to minimize economic value transfer. So in simple terms, when moving from this forward-looking rate of Jibar to the overnight rate of ZARONIA, all market participants need to deal with the adjustment spread made to their contracts. And in the event that any contracts would mature post-Jibar cessation, we refer to those as potential tough legacy contracts. So these are those contracts that are not as easy to transition and that could potentially result in issues that may require the use of legislative instruments to help transition. So that brings us to the amendment of the Financial Sector Regulation Act. So within this act, my colleague Mlu will touch on that in the tough legacy contracts session later this afternoon. But in simple terms, this is a legislative instrument that will aim to ensure that all parties are protected and no single party feels aggrieved through the transition program. And this catch-all phrase that we look out for are safe harbor provisions. Again, safe harbor provisions are also included in the glossary. So some key takeaways. I think this slide would be important for all attendees to at least keep in the back of your mind throughout the rest of the day, because these are not just dates, but these are important milestone dates that play a significant role. So today we will touch on the JIBAR cessation date made on behalf of the MPG by the SARB Deputy Governor, and that will be unpacked in the first session. We will also look at the endgame for JIBAR session, which will touch on the no new JIBAR milestone. So that is penciled in for the first quarter of next year. And lastly, we will gear up for the eventual cessation date and what needs to be done before that. So it's a critical 12 months. As I mentioned, we do have a large number of contracts outstanding in terms of rand value. So market participants need to ensure that they have a keen understanding of their underlying exposures and that they take the necessary steps to ensure their readiness. So that sense of urgency will be highlighted throughout the remainder of this day. So finally, it's important to remember that the transition will likely differ by product. So some instruments can transition actively, others will rely on legislative mechanisms, and others may undergo a passive transition. So again, these are technical concepts once again, which are unpacked in great detail in the transition approach document, which we will circulate and share with attendees in the course of the day. So that document will also be unpacked in the first session, and it underscores key transition approaches as well as potential risks to any single approach. But this will be unpacked in the first session of the day. So importantly, each of these product sets do have different legal considerations. Muka already touched on the ISDA fallback protocol. Within money markets, there are fallback provisions as well. Fallback is another glossary term that you can look up. We will also look at note holder consent, and that essentially is getting consent from the holders of your bond instruments, given that this is going to be a major change to the underlying interest that your bond references. We will also look at loan markets and retail markets. So importantly, retail markets is largely dominated by home loans that reference JIBAR, retail mortgages. These will be covered in the tough legacy session, and a case study will be provided on SA home loans, which is largely driven by JIBAR referenced home loans. That session will also segue into a discussion on safe harbor provisions and tough legacy, as well as potential pricing adjustments, such as alternative rates, potentially moving to the prime reference rate, the prime lending rate, or to synthetic JIBAR, which will also be unpacked later in the day. So to wrap up, if you take away one message, it's that we are in the final stretch of the JIBAR transition. The building blocks are in place, and the focus now shifts across industry to implementation. So everything you'll hear for the rest of the day builds on what we've just covered. Credit adjustment spread fixing, contract fallbacks, yield curve construction, credit market development, tough legacy solutions, risk management expectations, and as well as supervisory priorities for the end game for JIBAR. So thank you very much. And we do have MPG workstream chairs as well as technical specialists in the audience. If you have any questions, as mentioned, I think now is a good time to ask your elementary questions for the day. Thank you. Sure. Okay, you can stand up here.
Okay. Doesn't look like it. Should we go?
Yes. Yes, please press the middle button.
Yes, I wanted. Hello? So I heard that the ZARONIA rate will be.
Sorry about that. Could sound please provide an alternative mic? I think there are a number of mics on the table.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Perfect.
So in the case where the ZARONIA rate was adjusted or updated and published on a Friday, does that rate hold over the weekend, or is it still going to be updated even during those days, even though they're not working days?
Sure. So ZARONIA is published on a T+1 basis. So on Friday morning, you would have had transactions from the day before, and that would be the rate that you see on Friday. But now on Monday, that would represent the overnight transactions from Friday. So you will only get Friday's rate on Monday morning, if that makes sense. Yes. So it's a backward-looking rate. So by definition, it's using transactions one day before. And just in terms of the process, we do receive files from the various banks, transaction files, before 7 a.m. each day. And we conduct our checks from there. And after those checks are done, we essentially apply the calculation methodology that Muka touched on to those transactions. And then the rate is published at 10 a.m. Thank you.
Does that mean we don't consider weekend transactions?
No, we don't consider weekend transactions.
Thank you.
Zakele?
Yeah, sure. Good morning, everybody. So the rate determined for Friday would be applied for Saturday and Sunday, especially if we are compounding the rate on a daily basis. Similarly, that will apply also over holidays. The last rate would be applied for the day of that holiday, and that becomes important, of course, as I said, when we're calculating compounded ZARONIA, the period averages. Thanks.
Thank you. I hope that answers your question. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, there was a question here.
Sorry, we can't.
Okay, I wanted to understand, you mentioned that some of the retail mortgages will require manual intervention, basically legal intervention. I would like to find out how would that look like and what kind of contract would those be, because most of the bonds reference prime.
Sure. Thank you very much. That is a very good question, and I don't want to steal the thunder from our panelists, and that will be covered in the session on tough legacy and retail mortgages later this afternoon. So please park that question, and if Abdul, Ismail, and Mlu don't answer the question, please raise it again. Thank you very much.
Hi, I have a question. So, as you mentioned that from April 30th next year, maybe there will be no longer new bonds, loans to be provided to our clients. So do you think that for the transition timeline, and although the final cessation date will be December next year, so do you think you will encourage the financial institutions to give a transition for our existing legacy loans, bonds, or derivatives prior to the final transition date as soon as possible? For example, our existing loans to the borrowers should be transitioned like in March, May, so far before the December cessation date, or you encourage us to transition them on the cessation date. So which is your preference? Earlier is better, or on the final date?
Sure. Thank you very much. If I miss anything, I will lean on our technical specialist in the transition workstream. But ideally, we would want transition to take place prior to cessation date, well, to the extent where that is possible. Paul, do you have any comments to add there? Thank you.
Thanks, Noid. I think that's absolutely right. So the preference is definitely for active transition, whereby you would contractually amend your existing JIBAR transactions to a alternative reference rate, ZARONIA being the preferred successor rate. I think part of that question may have touched on adoption. So where, should we be transacting in ZARONIA-linked contracts already? Certainly, we'd like to see more ZARONIA transactions being done in the market. There's already been quite good build-up, and we'll discuss that in some later panels. But certainly, market participants should be ready to trade in ZARONIA. And by March, that new JIBAR transactions effectively won't be available to market participants. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Paul. Nirian.
Noid, thank you so much. I think I touched on this in the morning when I met you. I just want to flag it because I might not stay the full session. In terms of the discussion you had around contracts that referencing JIBAR, I mean, it's quite well known that most of it stems in the derivative space and related to interest rate swaps. What goes hand in hand with that was, as I mentioned, is under the CSAs that underpin those contracts and them referencing SAFEX. We'd like to know some thoughts around SAFEX, and because in the the literature that's been published, it talks to the transition of SAFEX and JIBAR. However, a lot of the credit spread adjustments has been in relation to JIBAR, and we run quite a lot of SAFEX versus JIBAR basis. If you think about forward contracts that are quoted and traded, and so we just want some clarity around what's been done. I mean, you've given me some context. I want to flag it for the benefit of everyone else. They have to go hand in hand. You can't just transition JIBAR without looking at the benchmark that underpins a lot of the CSAs where clients post our cash. So just to flag to you, I might catch up later if I don't stay the full session to hear from the specialist. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you very much, Nirian. So I think for the benefit of the audience, Nirian has provided a lot of technical jargon which in the derivative space. So CASs are credit adjustment spreads, which Muka has touched on, and CSAs are credit support annexures. So these are annexures to contracts derivative contracts which require holders or market participants or investors to park margin to trade these derivative contracts. Now, this margin is remunerated at the rate known as SAFEX overnight. So that is essentially a published rate by the JSE. That rate has never actually been endorsed for use as a benchmark or as a reference rate by the JSE. It just happened to proliferate and become a very popular rate. So in practice, to answer your question, Nirian, work is being done by a sub-working group of the derivative workstream looking at the between SAFEX overnight versus ZARONIA. So similar to how backward-looking compounded ZARONIA is compared to JIBAR to determine that credit adjustment spread, which is the differential between the rates. Similar work is being done to look at the differential between SAFEX overnight versus ZARONIA. And again, we'll park this discussion. I think there will be a rich debate a bit later on in the day regarding how SAFEX overnight, which as you rightly point out, is widely used, and I think the market would like some clarity on how that is being treated. Thanks.
One last question. Do you think 1 year is sufficient to transition? I mean, the whole, ZARONIA, JIBAR from JIBAR to ZARONIA transition process took roughly 2 years as a concept to form. And then now we have 1 year to transition, and next year is roughly the last year. Is 1 year realistic?
That's a hot potato pass. One is that actually we've been on this journey for about 4 years in terms of having released the JIBAR transition roadmap. It's just that now we are entering the final phase whereby we are expecting market participants to actively transition and to do it fairly quickly before the benchmark is discontinued. The journey started even before that because you would recall that the consultation paper on which benchmarks should we be looking at started with the consultation paper released, I think it was 2018. So in a way, the journey has been long, and we are entering the final phase, and we believe that it is possible to transition within this year. Thanks.
Thank you, Tekele. Any other questions? Okay. Oh, sorry, yes, one more.
I just wanted to ask again, you said that as from March 2026, no new Jibar contracts will be written. So is there a threshold or like a certain limit on how long those policies, those contracts should take before they mature? Because from December or end of 2026, we should be using ZARONIA.
Sure, so just to clarify, the question is, are we going to, are you allowed to issue new contracts that reference Jibar? Sorry, just to clarify, what is?
Oh, yes, I'm saying, we said from March 2026, no new contracts should
No new
be-
contracts referencing
Yes.
Jibar? No
So
new
is
Jibar.
there a threshold on how long those contracts should be before they mature? Because as at December 2026, we should be using ZARONIA.
Sure. So I think we do have a slide showing the maturity date of certain instruments that will mature post Jibar cessation. So those are the tough legacy contracts that we defined, largely the tough legacy contracts that will need to be addressed.
Oh, okay.
Paul, please come in.
Yeah, thanks. We'll cover that in some detail in the no new Jibar session. But practically, we looking to make sure that beyond the cessation date, that we limit the amount of transactions that require transition. So I would expect that transactions that are short-dated, that don't extend beyond the cessation date, would be fine in terms of the use. Jibar will still be published. It'll still continue to be continue to have rigorous oversight by the SARB until the cessation date. So the expectation would be that, if there happen to be short-dated transactions referencing Jibar that need to be done that don't extend beyond the cessation date, that should probably be fine. The mechanism for that oversight is really a prudential oversight mechanism through the PA and the FSCA in terms of monitoring financial institutions, adoption of the no new Jibar principle as part of the prudential oversight. So I think it's effectively principle-based in that regard. But the critical point is not to try and reduce the stock of transactions that require transition.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Paul. Nirayan?
Sorry, just my last question. The credit spread adjustment, the 5-year look-back period, there was some literature around obviously looking at outliers and obviously periods like COVID, etc. I tried to look on the MPG website, but wasn't very clear around the dates that were looked. So I don't know if was it that you've taken a 5-year period and, taken out certain outliers, or have you kept the days consistent in that you have, 1,800 odd days of data? I'm just trying to work back to the actual rate, just so we do our own analytics internally as well.
Sure. Thanks, Nirayan. So that work was also was also done in great detail by a sub-working group of the transition workstream. So again, I will defer to Paul to touch base on the work done by his team on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Reid. So I think it was important for the sub-workstream to look at the work done internationally on determining credit adjustment spreads and take guidance from ISDA in terms of the approach that had been adopted and what would be feasible in the local market. in terms of the analysis we did, we looked at the standard ISDA approach, and we looked at any of our own market idiosyncrasies, or looked at the time period difference between when that decision was made by ISDA through their consultation processes and what's occurred subsequent to that. And we looked at fairly lengthy time periods and various different time buckets. And what we were trying to conclude was whether there was a material difference between the standard ISDA approach, which would be well understood, and whether any of the market idiosyncrasies or interest rate movements that we had seen subsequently in the market would need us to adjust that spread. And we concluded that there wasn't sufficient difference between the standard ISDA approach and any other time periods, given the data that we had available for ZARONIA. So the decision was to go ahead with the standardized approach that ISDA published.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Paul. Okay, I see we are out of time and we do need to prepare for the main proceedings of the day. So thank you very much for your attention. And again, if you think of any questions, please feel free to interject at the Q&A sessions in the remainder of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our speakers, Muka and Naweed, for guiding us through the journey